can say definitively that religions are all bullshit.
Welcome to Brainstorm.
We have the explicit tag for a reason.
This is a base level argument to a higher level morality.
I get paid to science?
To science as much as one can science.
What the hell was my point?
Trigger warning. The Brainstorm podcast will criticize your most cherished beliefs. We attack nonsense in all its forms and discuss difficult subjects. If you peddle pseudoscience, supernatural woo, or religious dogma, then this is not your safe place. This is the home of hardcore skepticism.
Hi, and welcome to the Brainstorm podcast. This is an extra episode in between our regular scheduled episodes. I'm not sure if everyone's seeing things this way, but lately I've been witness to a whole lot of talk about sexual harassment in and around the atheist and skeptic community. Talk of well-known speakers, popular podcasters, and Facebook page owners has been reaching my ears more than at any other time that I can remember. In the face of this, the MythCon situation, and the much larger Harvey Weinstein situation, I felt that it was important to speak to someone about the issue of sexual harassment who has had experience dealing with these allegations in our community. Stephanie Zvan is fairly well known and has written about sexual harassment and assault in the past, and I was very lucky to have someone with her perspective on things to discuss this with me. In case you didn't know it already, because for some reason this showed up in your podcast playlist and Brainstorm is set to the top already because you love the show already, and just didn't see the title. This is a content warning. We're going to talk about sexual harassment. We don't get into the nitty-gritty of things too much, but for people who are sensitive to the subject, we don't really shy away from stuff either. So here it is, my interview with Stephanie Zvan, right after a couple promos from a couple podcasts.
Oh, hey there. I didn't see you. I'm Sarah, the host of the Salty Canadian podcast. If you want a podcast that is full of fun, rants, reviews, and just random stuff, then this is a podcast for you. We can be found on any podcast catcher, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and have a great day.
Have you heard the Habeas Humor podcast? It's a new legal show with lots of thoughtful analysis.
That must have been like a desert fart of dry excitement.
Famous politicians, or at least people who went to school with them.
And then she says, have you met Barack Obama? And I'm asking, who the heck is Shakalama?
And legal tips. You can still be rapey if your dick doesn't work, the more you know. Disney can't sue me if I don't sing it. HABEASHUMOR.
This is a Brainstorm podcast extra episode. I've been doing the odd one when something comes up that I feel kind of needs to be talked about but doesn't fit into our regular schedule. So I'm here with Stephanie Zvan. Zvan.
Yep.
To talk about sexual harassment in the skeptic community. And it's a pretty heavy topic, I guess. I don't know quite where to start other than, I guess, maybe I should ask you a little bit of your background and where people might know you from first.
Sure. Within the movement, I'm known for a few different things. I've been writing at Almost Diamonds on first Free Thought blogs and now the Orbit blog networks for several years now. I also, on and off since 2009, have been one of the hosts for Atheists Talk Radio, which is a live radio show that Minnesota Atheists does at a local station on Sunday mornings, which means, of course, we don't get the benefits of sleeping in on Sundays.
Right.
I've spoken a few places, largely at Convergence, which is a local science fiction and fantasy convention, talking about really mostly skeptical topics, although some feminist topics as well, but teaching people how to do things like evaluate the science journalism that they see in the local paper, that sort of thing.
That sounds like a useful project to work on.
I hope so. We certainly need it.
So I guess I'm not really sure how to really broach the subject. We talked about this on our Friday broadcast of Brainstorm, a little bit of sexual harassment because of Harvey Weinstein. And today and yesterday, there's been the Me Too hashtag going around and kind of a campaign going around where we can see all the various, all the women that have been subject to sexual harassment or assault. And I wonder if maybe you can give me some thoughts on what do you think of that?
Sure. This has absolutely nothing to do with the people who are participating and telling their stories or even just breaking silence for the first time and saying, me too. That's an incredibly brave thing to do. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be. It should be the kind of thing where you say that and you get support, but
Right.
We're still just not in that position. But, I find the campaign personally somewhat frustrating, in part because people have been talking about this for years. I mean, I wrote up the story of my sexual assault back in 2009 on my blog, trying to get people to take rape seriously. And so the problem has never been that people don't know this happens. Everybody knows this happens. You may or may not have a good sense that it has, that, a large percentage of the women you know have been assaulted or even raped, or that harassment is so pervasive that almost everybody particularly the women, but also, non-binary folks, men who are otherwise in marginalized populations. Almost all of those folks have been harassed. So I see it and I appreciate that people are doing it, and I really want to know what people are going to do to change it.
I think that's a fair assessment. Like, it's something that seems to require action of some sort. I'm probably in the similar boat to many people where what I don't know is what to do necessarily. Right.
And I don't want to make it sound like nothing has happened. Back in 2012, about a year after Elevator Gate, when Rebecca Watson told folks to maybe not corner people who have said they don't want to be propositioned in an elevator at 3 a.m. to invite them back up to their hotel room for coffee.
Right.
About a year after that happened, at Women in Secularism, Jen McCrite was on the stage and she talked about the fact that since she became a speaker in the movement, people had taken her aside as a young woman and warned her which other speakers to stay away from.
Right.
And there was some action in response to that, largely because a few of us, me definitely included, took the opportunity to say, look, we need codes of conduct. We need anti-harassment policies. We need you basically to tell everybody, not just your speakers, although they're the ones in the best position to think they can get away with it, but also your attendees, that this isn't tolerated at your space, that if this happens and somebody reports it, there will be consequences. And that did happen. At this point, nearly every conference has that. Even Mythinformation Con, the Mythicist Milwaukee guys, were talking about, look, we have this great code of conduct.
Right.
I'm not entirely sure that I would trust them to enforce it.
Yeah.
But they might surprise me pleasantly even while, jumping in on politics. So some things have happened. I also should mention that when we're talking about sexual harassment in the movement, we're talking about two different things. We are talking about, and started out largely talking about several years ago, a situation where women who were showing up to meetings that were almost entirely men were being treated as though they were there to date, that they were being propositioned, that they, that nobody was interested in what they had to say unless it was yes.
Right.
So that's one class.
Yeah. I seem to recall something about, because I kind of entered the movement back in, I don't know, got to be just about 10 years ago, but I was never at any conferences, but I did see stuff online about how people were saying that unless you, like, these should not be meat markets. So you're not there to pick up people. They're supposed to be educational conferences or meetings or support groups in a sense, and that's not what they were.
Right. And, there's nothing wrong with meeting somebody and getting involved with them at one of these meetings. There's nothing wrong with hooking up at a conference, but that's not what they're there for. And that's the assumption that any woman who goes to that is looking for sex, is one of the things that was driving women away. They'd show up for one meeting, they'd get hit on several times, nobody would pay any attention to what they had to say otherwise, and they would never come back.
Right.
Which, when you're telling us, we want more women in the movement, we need more women to show up, you have to do something about that.
Yeah, that isn't conducive to an inviting atmosphere, I suppose.
Right. And then the other kind of harassment that we're talking about is something that I would classify more as political harassment. And anybody who's been following what happened with Sargon at the Myth Information Con has a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about, because we're talking about the kind of thing where there's a woman, a member of parliament, who is doing a campaign to basically end rape and this kind of sexualized harassment. And what does he say to her? I wouldn't even rape you. And then a bunch of his followers come in and follow that up with rape threats. And that's the use of gender, the use of sexuality, sexual imagery, rape threats, sexual violence, that kind of thing, to shut people out of political conversations where they should be having a say. And that happened to pretty much all of us who worked on the campaign to get codes of conduct in place.
Right. Yeah, that's a particularly bad example, but seems to be a spectrum of these kind of shutting down of women's voices whenever they say something slightly dissenting.
I also got a "you're too ugly to rape." It's not just it's not just Sargon, and it's not just outside the movement. It happens here too.
I guess I just did like a little solo bit for my patrons, where I kind of expressed how oblivious I must have been to what was going on, and how privileged a position it must have, like, I was coming from, that I didn't see this. And I wonder, like, how do you think that people like myself who have seen it now can kind of spread more awareness, or like, what can I do to stop this from happening?
Honestly, the biggest thing people can do right now is not necessarily stop promoting all of the same white male faces who are already prominent in the movement, because, they have some stuff to say, but actually pay attention to what you're sharing. When you're sharing this guy who himself is oblivious to these problems and perhaps even incensed when somebody brings it up in language he doesn't like, are you also sharing the people who talk about these problems? Are you sharing the people who would know about these problems? Are you sharing women? Are you sharing non-binary people? Are you sharing people of color? Are you making those voices that people already listen to? I say this a lot. And, it sometimes helps for a while and then it goes back to kind of the way it was, because it's a really, really hard habit to break.
Right.
You do it without being thanked for a while. You'll do it without necessarily being sure that the people you're sharing are saying things that are right, because you haven't heard this before, so you don't necessarily know. And so it takes a lot of work, and it sounds like a simple thing when I say it.
Right.
Share women, share people of color, share non-binary folks.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's putting it into practice is something you just have to keep paying attention to.
Right. I recognize, like, when we were organizing our first conference in 2016, or I guess it was 2015, we were organizing it. And somebody messaged me after we had 5 or 6 speakers already booked. And they said, "So where are the women?" And I was like, oh shit. Yep. I didn't even occur to me that I had missed that boat, and I hadn't thought of that. So, we scrambled quickly when we got things organized in a different way and got a couple women speakers. But it is amazing how easy it is to just all the voices you see are white men and so you share that, or you book them because that's what's on the top of your head. And then people of color and women and these marginalized groups get bypassed over and over again if nobody stops and thinks, right?
It's a really well-known bias, documented by sociologists and psychologists all the time. You ask people to name, their favorite, their prominent, whatever, and the list starts out, unless you are talking to somebody who does this a lot and specifically trains themselves to do this. Yeah. The list starts out with white men. Right. So I don't know why. I have some ideas why, but I don't know why we don't talk about those kinds of biases more in the skeptic movement. But we should, and we should be paying attention to them in ourselves. So, yes.
Yeah. It seems like we really like to point out biases and logical fallacies, except when they're something that is internal, right?
Right.
So
yeah, the idea that skepticism is being smarter than other people, and I hate even using that word because, frankly, I have a whole talk on what smarter even means. So I do. But the idea that we're smarter than other people seems to be what appeals to a lot of people about skepticism, and I get that because skepticism is so much work.
Right.
It's not even something we can apply to everything, or we'd be sitting around just, thinking things out our entire lives and not ever doing anything. But
yeah, for sure.
Honestly, that's such a hard thing to fight in the skeptic movement.
Yeah. I always try to remember, and I know Stephen Novella is another white dude, but his line the one time was that it's not an identity. It should be a method that you apply to as many things as you can. And it should be, aimed at yourself more than anything. So, and it just doesn't get done.
Yeah. Yep.
But I want to, what do you think? Do you think that this Me Too or the awareness brought up by some of these larger cases that, I don't know, for at least the skeptic community all seem to be happening at once? Do you think that this kind of awareness will be long lasting, or do you think that it'll fade into the background again like it has so many other times?
Well, that depends, because honestly, I don't think it's really faded into the background. There are a lot of ways in which it's been pushed into the background.
True.
I mean, when Rebecca Watson spoke up about Elevator Gate, she embarrassed somebody who was close to Dawkins, and then she ended up embarrassing Dawkins, which really means Dawkins embarrassed himself, and she pointed it out.
Right.
With his Dear Muslima comments. And for that, she got blackballed.
Yeah.
He refused to appear on any stage with her. A lot of other people felt the pressure not to bring her to stuff. It didn't just come from Dawkins, obviously.
Right.
And so she doesn't talk much in the skeptic movement anymore. And that's not an accident. That's not people forgetting her.
Right,
that's a political move. And, honestly, we're seeing shades of that after Myth-Information Con with, okay, so those people were right, but gosh, they were awfully mean. And they said some things that were really hyperbolic and not perfect. And maybe they were kind of angry about the fact that somebody who says, I wouldn't even rape you, got invited to be on stage and featured at a conference.
Right.
And so the people who objected to that are already being delegitimized. So it's not just a fading, it's a pushing.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's well, it's not fair. That's a fair view of it. You're right.
And if I sound bitter, it's because it happened to me too, damn it.
Right. Well, yeah, I may have been guilty of things like that in the past. Like before I'm fairly new to the SJW-isms and the feminism type stuff just in the last couple of years. And I may have been a party to some of these, like, no, don't listen to her. She's just part of this outrage machine that goes on. And
oh, come on. Can we use the words outrage brigade? It's not like you started it.
No, that's true. Yeah. It does. Yeah. I see a lot of personal culpability in some of this stuff myself. And I wonder if there's a way that, we can move forward and try and do better, I guess.
Well, when you have control of a couple of things. You have control of a podcast. You have partial control of a conference.
Yeah.
You get to decide who to bring in. And you get to decide both whether you're going to bring in the people who spoke up and whether you are going to bring in the people who are trying to delegitimize them.
Right.
So you have some control over that. And, I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm doing it in part because from what I'm seeing, you're making an effort to actually consciously make those decisions. And I appreciate it. And it frustrates me a little that the people who are already working on that are always the people who are saying, so what more can we do?
Right. Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. But, rather than the people who don't make any effort, they're not ever trying, like they don't seem to be trying to even get past where they're at.
Right. But I mean, even if you're just somebody with like a Facebook feed, you get to decide whose stuff you share, and you get to decide, when your friends start talking down about SJWs and maybe even cucks.
Yeah.
Because the word now.
Yep.
You get to decide how you respond to them. And, it doesn't have to be marching off to war, but even a dude, really?
Right,
makes
yeah.
a world difference.
It's often easier to make a comment that just is like, that doesn't make much sense, or, rather than to go into a long spiel and try and convince somebody of your perspective. Sometimes it doesn't.
A lot of this isn't decided by rational arguments. A lot of this is, frankly, I mean, we talk about how terrible it is that things are tribal, but We decide what floats in our tribe.
Yeah,
that's part of the point of having a tribe, is that it meets our standards. So, you're always getting to set standards among the people who value you as a human being.
Yeah. I guess I've got a kind of a situation that me and some mutual friends have been unsure of what to do with, and I wonder if you have maybe some insight. Like, we all can say that if somebody tells us personally that they've been sexually harassed by someone, then we can believe them. It's a first-hand account, and we can take that as at their word. But sometimes these things are more like all you ever see is a bunch of people talking about a situation, and you never really know what the bare bones of it is. And I wonder, is it enough to see that someone has been accused of sexually harassing someone else to take a kind of boycott type action in relation to them? Or what is the appropriate response from your perspective?
That is actually a hard question. I know people who the only reason that I know they were accused of harassment is because they needed somebody to talk about how terrible it was.
Right.
And I've seen the documentation in some of these cases. I've been the person keeping track of it because, frankly, that's not uncommon when you get like a stalking or abuse situation, in that the abuser turns around and makes accusations against the person they're abusing.
Right.
Because abusers will use pretty much anything against you. They don't care that it, hurts other people.
Yeah.
But, in a situation like that, you can still often kind of sit down and think about really just what it is that you know.
Yeah.
Is this a single person doing this, making the accusation? Is it multiple people? Because it doesn't, one false accusation is already pretty rare.
Right,
hard to say exactly in harassment because it's mostly been studied in rape. But
right.
But still, the costs are high, so false accusations are rare.
Yeah.
If it's multiple accusations, we're talking suddenly a lot more rare. We're getting into the realm of conspiracy theory.
Right, yeah.
And, the way that we view conspiracy theory and the kinds of weighting of probability that we do there starts to apply.
Yeah.
If this person is defending themselves, are they doing it with a bunch of irrelevancies? I had consent to do this. They asked me to do this. Here's this thing of them saying something that is absolutely not them asking me to do this.
Right,
well,
right.
Why are you showing me that instead of just them asking? Yeah. Why are you going out of your way to say they're a bad person or untrustworthy in some way instead of just providing the evidence that would clear it all up?
Right.
Because one of the things that happens with harassment allegations is something called the nut and slut strategy, which is, that woman accused me of harassment. She's crazy, and also she sleeps around a lot, so don't believe her.
That sounds really familiar.
Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose that if it's got a name, it means it's common enough that everybody's probably seen that. Yeah.
Yep. And there was a pretty famous case of somebody doing something that looked very much like that a few years back in the skeptic movement. So,
yeah.
So believing somebody doesn't necessarily mean throwing all of your faculties to the wind. And honestly, a lot of times what it means is refusing to participate in tearing somebody down because they made an accusation of harassment.
Right.
Because that's one of the things that happens. Or stopping other people from tearing them down. Because for all you don't know that somebody actually did harass, you also don't know that somebody made something up.
Right,
and even just putting people on that equal level goes a long way toward dealing with some of the ugliest situations we have already. But then, just think about what you're being told. Think about whether the defense makes sense.
Right. Yeah. I've talked about this. We've on private conversations with my podcast panel, like multiple times over the months, because so often when these things come up, then you're faced with we already had them booked as a guest. Do we disinvite them? Do we let inform other people about what's going on or the situation? And we're always wondering what the most ethical stance or place to be is. And I've always kind of thought that, okay, well, obviously you side with the victim in the sense that they don't have anything to gain from lying about being harassed because of the already very common backlash that people get. It's
certainly a decent place to start. I mean, as rules of thumb go,
that's
not bad.
It's not bad. But then it's always. My girlfriend, she says that I might just be wanting to see somebody as innocent when they're accused because of my own biases. So I try very hard to overcome that at the same time. And there's a few cases going on in the skeptic community right now that you go, how do I, approach this person? Should I not be communicating with this person anymore? And I look at it from these perspectives, and then I was talking to, even on Friday's broadcast, our co-host Lisa, she said, like, Corey, you're looking at this from this, what's the impact of the community? How do I behave in these situations? And she says, and all I want to be is safe when I walk into a room. So, I mean,
well, that's another thing. I mean, when you're talking about how you interact with somebody, and especially when you're in a fairly public position like you are, what do people looking at your behavior see?
Right.
Because sadly, they can't tell whether you're all torn up about it unless you're really, the conversation like you and I are having right now is not a conversation people have a lot.
Right. Should probably be something that's more common, but
yeah. So that's always something you have to keep in mind. And, sometimes there are things where you can say, okay, so, and this is not a hypothetical, Richard Carrier is suing me and a bunch of other people for talking about him making unwanted advances.
Right.
There is a lawsuit in process. Do you maybe want to hang out while that's in process, and just kind of the hands off because it'll come to some kind of resolution? Or
right.
Do you want to make some kind of statement about somebody who would sue over that kind of an allegation? But, again, I'm biased there.
Right,
so.
I suppose. But I do think that says something, right? Like that the way that a person counter accuses, in a sense, says something about whether or not they're willing to address the evidence as it actually is.
Yeah. And, again, I know a number of people who have had accusations thrown at them because they are men who speak up about sexual harassment and assault. And that's one of those things that people are really gung-ho about, turning around and then accusing those men of sexual assault. And those guys, they're like, here's this person saying this. Take a look.
Right. Look at our interactions.
You can see what else they have to say about sexual harassment and assault. My personal opinion is they're not really serious about this. But you take a look for yourself.
Yeah. It seems that we should be a community where we can support people who have been victimized without, like you say, abandoning our critical thinking faculties. We do seem to be very hung up on innocent until proven guilty. I've discussed this with a few people in the podcasting community as well. And I kind of, what do you think of the guilty by social media type idea versus whether somebody would be guilty in a court of law?
So the reason that we apply the standard of innocent until proven guilty in criminal cases is that the accused is actually being accused by the state. Right. And that state has huge power. It has immense resources to bring against somebody to try to prove them guilty. And so we set the bar on that very high.
Right.
And that's reasonable. It doesn't always end up with a just outcome, but it's a pretty decent principle. When we're talking about two people on social media, one accusing, one denying, we're talking about people who generally are more or less on even footing. When we're talking about somebody accusing somebody of misusing their power, either their social power and reach, as a speaker, writer, podcaster, whatever, we're actually talking about an imbalance of power most of the time. Because,
right,
frankly, your ideal victim is not somebody with a social media megaphone. And again, most of these things are not false accusations.
Yeah.
Just figuring out which ones is the problem. So I mean, unless we're going to give that person the power that the state has and the resources that the state has to try to do this, I don't see why we should apply the same standard.
Yeah.
And frankly, we don't. I mean, even the people saying that don't apply that standard.
Right. Yeah. They're not. When somebody says so-and-so is an asshole, then people just accept, well, the people around them will just maybe accept that. But then when it comes to sexual harassment, they're all like, oh, innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, not that I want
a very different standard to that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
Assuming they even grant that it's a problem in the first place, because that doesn't even always happen. Unless it rises to the level of a crime, there's nothing to talk about. Except that there is stuff to talk about, because as a movement, as folks who put together events, as people who put together groups, as people who put together podcasts, we have goals. We're not just doing this because we have way too much time on our hands. And a bunch of extra money of our own to throw at this stuff, because frankly, most people lose money at it, don't make it.
That's right.
we're doing it because we have goals. And so if these things aren't in line with our goals, we should maybe be saying, yep, that's actually problem behavior. It doesn't meet our goals.
Yeah, for sure. Is there room for somebody to try to redeem themselves if they have been accused and or even admitted to doing something like harassment?
Right now, de facto, there is infinite room. There are infinite chances because, frankly, the people who are really upset about this stuff are not the people in charge of doing that.
True.
Should there be room? Honestly, I don't even like the question because...
Fair enough.
who else gets infinite chances?
Yeah, no, that's true.
Who gets put on stage? Do you suddenly get put on stage because you harassed somebody and then apologized for it?
Right.
Because we got a whole bunch of people who never harassed anybody, who have really interesting things to say, who we've never put on stage.
Yeah.
Many of them because they're people in vulnerable positions who are more likely to be harassed. So...
No, that's fair.
I theoretically don't see any reason that somebody can't come back and be a great person and do good work after that, but it's just not my priority.
Right, yeah. When there's, like you say, there's so many voices out there that, by people who haven't harassed or haven't assaulted people, and I would imagine that we would treat assault in a different way or maybe just more severely the same way?
As somebody who's organized conferences, I don't really want to have to deal with that while I'm running a conference. I've got better things to do than to try and make sure people are safe from somebody who's already got a history of making problems.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, I don't know. I never seem to be able to make myself feel okay about any of the situation surrounding any of these things. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I'll let you in on a little secret. There is no feeling okay about this once you start thinking about it and once you start working on it. It's some of the hardest work I've done in my life, and I have to take breaks sometimes. And as much as I want to help everybody who comes to me and has a story and so on and so forth, if I did that, I would be torn apart. I wouldn't survive.
Yeah, I suppose that's where the idea of self-care comes in. Like,
yeah. And why thinking about boundaries and consent is really one of the important things that somebody working on this can do, because it doesn't just apply to sex. It applies to all of the ways in which people might put demands on your time and your emotional energy and all of that. You have to know what your limits are.
No, that's fair enough. I suppose, I think that's pretty much all the kind of questions that I have. Is there something that we didn't touch on that you think maybe should be addressed?
The one big thing that I would say at this point, as a movement, is that, we've got these codes of conduct in place, and they're not just at conferences. They're at a lot of, small local groups with meetups and that kind of thing. They apply to an awful lot of interactions. The thing that we really need to get better at doing going forward is stop treating this like we're arguing some little legal technicalities.
Right.
And really think about this in terms of what serves our purposes as a movement, in terms of what supports the diversity that we claim to want to have, in terms of who does the work in our movements, because frankly, they don't get the credit, but, women fill an awful lot of these volunteer roles and definitely disproportional to their numbers in the movement.
Right.
And we need to think about who and what we value, because it makes so many of these little decisions just easier, simpler, faster, clearer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I suppose once a person decides that they value consent and, like say boundaries and not victimizing people further when they've had to deal with things, then I suppose that does lay out a bit more of a clear path, right? Once you've decided that those things are important, or you realize that those things are important, then yeah, I think it does actually make things a little bit more clear about what one should do.
Yeah. And it's part of something that is a challenge to the secular and skeptic movements as a whole right now,
right,
is really just thinking about what it is we value instead of trying to argue everything from a bunch of first principles that we might not even agree on.
Yeah. Do you think that there are ultimately going to be two separate movements in a sense? Like, because it does seem like, from my perspective, that we've got the YouTube shitlord movement is its own thing, even though they like to use the label skeptic. And I think that while our group, the SJW skeptics, we have our own issues and there seems to be right now a group kind of sitting in the middle. And I wonder, is there a way to appeal to those middle people?
Well, the thing is, we're already, at least a good half a dozen movements. Black atheists, they're their own movement, and they're segregated for really, really good reasons. I mean, we've been talking mostly about gender and sex here, but the things that Black speakers and attendees have been subjected to in this movement, there are really good reasons they have their own groups.
Yeah.
The ex-Muslims are their own, at least one movement at this point, for somewhat similar reasons, but also just because, everything that the main atheist movement in the U.S. says comes from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
Women, by and large, already have a parallel movement. A lot of the people who used to identify as skeptics are doing work educating audiences about science instead, because they've been pushed out from under that label. So, and I don't think any of those movements are particularly trying all that hard to appeal to that group sitting comfortably on the fence in the middle, because that was a lot of what they went to get away from. It wasn't just that they were getting harassed. It was also that they weren't getting supported, and that they were getting called crazy and emotional and hysterical and all sorts of racist for, objecting to racist stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the middle's probably going to have to do some work if it wants to appeal to all of those groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. It shouldn't be those groups that are trying to appeal to the middle when they left for a reason.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And it won't work anyway.
Right. Yeah, no, that's right. People who are sitting humming and hawing about whether or not people of color get to have rights don't really get to be part of the conversation anymore, do they?
People who are still hemming and hawing over whether the bell curve is racist.
Right.
I mean, come on.
Yeah. Wow.
Seriously.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, I guess I've taken up enough of your time, and I think we covered what I wanted to cover. Like I say, I don't think that I'll ever feel okay about what's going on in the movement as long as people are being harassed. So,
well, and I have not been super gentle right here today. I have done a lot of challenging both you and your questions, and you've been a pretty good sport about it, and I appreciate that.
I appreciate the candid answers. I need that when it comes to this, because I've been so, I know that I have had my biases on the wrong side of the fence for a long time. So I appreciate the candid back and forth.
Thank you. I do too.
Where can people find your stuff? I guess we mentioned your shows at the end blog at the start, but may as well throw some links out. Sure.
The blog is Almost Diamonds on the Orbit Network, the-orbit.net/Almost Diamonds. You can also find me on Twitter at SZVAN.
Perfect. Well, I think that's everything. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So that was my interview with Stephanie Zvan about sexual harassment in the skeptic movement. I'm not sure what to say about it other than I hope it helps people understand more about the issue. I think the conversation helped me gain some insight as to how I should be looking at things. And I'm feeling even more sure that we need to boost the voices of women and people of color and members of the LGBTQ community at our conference. We actually have a few dates in mind for that, and I hope that we can get enough funds to get this going. We really we need to reach about half our goal in order to commit to our speakers. You can support that by heading to gofundme.com/shift-to-reason-conference with 2018 with dashes in between all those. There will be a link in the show notes as well. Make sure to listen to next Monday's show when we discuss sexual harassment as a panel on the second half of our usual broadcast. Or you can go get it now on Patreon by becoming a patron and getting the full-length ad-free version of the show. That's patreon.com/brainstorm podcast. And at $1 an episode, that gets you access to the full-length ad-free show with the music break included. Other than that, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com. And as usual, brainstormblog.net. The show notes there are a work in progress. I try to make them very detailed and with links to everything where you can access absolutely everything that we touch on, and even the ads where you can find the podcasts that we play the ads for. And hopefully I can catch up with that eventually. I want to thank our financial supporters, Aaron, Daryl, Destin Sucks, Lachlan, Lisa, Magnus, Michael, Nathan, Positively Skeptical, Rob, Stephanie, and Will. If you want to join their ranks and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. You can join us live every second week when we broadcast live on Spreaker. You can find us at Spreaker.com/user/brainstormpodcast. And our next guest is actually Rob from Secular Yakking and possibly Amy from Secular Yakking. I want to really thank Stephanie for joining me for this interview. You can find out more of her stuff at the-orbit.net/almostdiamonds. I'll put a link to that in the show notes on thebrainstormpodcast.com. So, thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Alex Capper-Murdoch for doing our voiceover for the intro and for the ads we played during the normal show. And thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff over at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
This is an opinion-based podcast. Each person on the podcast is responsible for their own opinions, and those opinions don't necessarily reflect the views of the rest of the panel. Any guests or anyone associated with the people on the podcast, such as spouses, partners, children, other family members, friends, or employers. No one person speaks for the podcast with the possible exception of Corey, and he doesn't speak for anyone else on the show. The Brainstorm podcast does not represent the views of our sponsors.
We just wanted to say thanks to everyone who listens to us, shares the show, gives us a rating on iTunes or Stitcher, or supports us through Patreon and Gumroad. We don't have a lot of interactions with our listeners, but what we have had proves that we attract some of the best people around. Smart, kind, and cool. An audience truly worthy of the titles hardcore and woo-free. Thanks for helping us make the world a smarter place.
Not sure what the heck was going on, but it was only recording on one side of the stereo
Fun.
track. Yeah. Okay. So I guess good place to start. I wonder. Shit! I lost my train of thought. Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay, so what was I saying? What the heck were we talking about?
The
biases.